Ethics in the workplace is a serious matter, but talking about it doesn't have to be business as usual. Chuck Gallagher, international business ethics expert, learned a lesson about choices and consequences the hard way. But now, he shares his experience so that others don't have to. In his compelling presentations, Chuck starts by setting the scene with his own story and ends by setting the stage for your organization's ethical success. Get real about business ethics with Straight Talk from Chuck Gallagher.
Mr. Gallagher, it's time.
Let's do it.
Every choice has a consequence. On October 2nd, 1995, I took 23 steps. That's the distance it took me to walk to here and back. As I took those steps, I thought about my wife. I thought about my two children, Rob and Alex. I thought about my career. I thought about the home that I lived in. I thought about everything that defined who I was. As I took those 23 steps, I was Chuck Gallagher. I was a somebody in the community that I lived in. On the 23rd step, I reached out my hand, opened the door, and stepped into federal prison. I became 11-6-42-058. What most of you in this room would define as a nobody. Every choice has a consequence. I want to ask you to do something. Stand to your feet, if you will, for just a second. Many of you in the room, you may know each other, you may not. The person to your left, to your right, in front, or to your back, those folks may not be known to you. Take a look around. Look at the folks that you're beside. Let's get to know you for a second. And now I want to ask you a question. I want you to think about something. I want you to think about your life and the choices that you have made. Think about every choice that you have made, those choices that immediately come to mind. And ask yourself this question: if you were transparent, if everything you had done was known by the person in front of you, behind you, to your left, or to your right, if it was that open and that transparent, would you regret some of the choices you made? Would you be ashamed of them? If you would regret or be ashamed of any choice that you had made thus far in your life, take a seat. In many presentations that I do, I ask that question. Most people will take a seat. Most people prefer their life not to be transparent. Occasionally there'll be a few folks that will stand up. I probably in my 20s would have been one of those folks standing up thinking that, well, my choices have been actually pretty good. Only to know that every choice has a consequence. Now, I happen to be lucky I have the keys, which does tend to work pretty nicely, except I have these things kind of backwards, so it takes just a little bit of effort. Plus, it's a blast going through airport security. You really don't have any clue in a carry-on bag just how wonderful it is to go through with handcuffs. But it is a bit humorous. Let me set these over here. Often the question will come up when we come into a meeting like this, Someone walks out in an orange jumpsuit and handcuffs and says every choice has a consequence. And the question that immediately takes place from the looks on the faces is, what did he do? You know, what happened? I mean, what's the real skinny behind this? So let me do this, because to put this in a frame of reference for a meeting that we're having today when we're talking about choices and consequences and ethical behavior, let's talk a little bit about the past. And if it took me 23 steps to get here, then let me rewind the tape so far and go back just a little bit. It was November of 1990. And at that particular point in time, I was a CPA. I was tax partner in a CPA firm. I taught continuing professional education courses to CPAs all around the country in 30 different states. I had testified before Congress. I wrote articles in national tax magazines. I was fairly recognized in the field of endeavor in the financial world that I was involved with. And so on that particular day, because most folks have to have some sort of continuing professional education, continuing education credits, I had this room full of CPAs taking a tax course. Now, as you can imagine, an 8-hour day of tax happens to be boring, or at least it is for most folks. So my job was to make it as educational as possible and also entertaining. So we would do fun kind of things, like have tax sing-along songs and so forth. And you all have sing-along songs in your education courses, don't you? And so we were having a pretty good time that day. And I guess we were on mountain time. I guess that's what it was in Idaho at the time. And so I'm sitting there and we break for lunch. And when we walked outside the doors, there was this pink slip on the door. It said, "While you were out." This was the message slip. Now today you would be text, or you would get an email, or whatever it happens to be. But in those days, it was a bit more archaic. As you can tell from the gray hair, I go back a ways. And so I go out the door, and it says, "Call your office ASAP." And I'm sitting there thinking to myself, you know, I'm hungry. But it's hunger or call the office, hunger, call the office. You know what I'll do? I'll just call the office, get that taken care of, and then I'll grab something to eat real quick. And so I go outside, pick up the pay telephone. Those were the days of pay telephone before you had a BlackBerry or some other phone. Pick up the telephone and call the office. And this is what I heard on the other end. One of my partners said, "Hey, Chuck," he said, "I know you're coming back. I don't remember if you're coming back tomorrow or Friday." This was a Wednesday. He said, "I don't remember, but one of the clients that you invested some money for, in any event, something happened and they had a financial change in circumstance and they need the money now. They need to liquidate that investment ASAP. If you'll tell me where the file is, I'll be happy to go ahead and initiate the process and help you out." Those were the words. I'm not sure how long the silence was, but here's what I knew. God knew, and I knew, I had not invested money for that client. I had stolen it. And I knew at that moment that the illusion that I had put in place years earlier was now about to be dissipated. The proverbial card had been pulled from the house of cards, and they were collapsing as I heard his voice. I wasn't really sure what to say, so I did the only thing that I knew to do, and that was I danced. I said, "Oh, Dan, don't worry about it. You know, number one, I'm going to be back tomorrow. Number two, this was an investment that's not easily liquidatable. It wasn't like it was on the NASDAQ exchange or New York exchange. It wasn't just a stock. I couldn't call up Chuck and say, 'Hey, liquidate the account.' There wasn't the electronic trading type thing at that particular point, and that wasn't the investment because it really was theft." I said, "But I have information. I'll go ahead and place the call right now. And dude, I hate to tell you, but I got to go. Time change different. Hungry, and I've got to get back to class." And he was like, "Oh, okay, well, you've got it under control?" "Yes, I've got it under control." And when I hung up the phone, I knew life had changed. I'm going to be very candid with you. I don't remember the rest of the afternoon. I really don't. I don't have a clue what took place that afternoon. I mean, I know I went back into the class, and in going back in, I taught what was supposed to be taught the rest of the afternoon. I had taught the course before, so I guess I was a bit on autopilot. They sat there and they shook their head and sang along and did all of the things that we were supposed to do. And at the end of the day, they all got up to walk out, get their continuing professional education credit form, and left the room. I, on the other hand, sat in that hotel before the cleaning folks came in to rearrange the room, and I cried like a baby. Life had changed. I honestly wasn't sure what to do. I went up to my room in the hotel and I actually considered suicide. The reality was I had and was experiencing what many would call a dark night of the soul. And for many of us, that dark night of the soul will come in one form or another at some time or another. So that night I sat there and I took the Yellow Pages. Today we'd Google it, but those days it was Yellow Pages. So I took the Yellow Pages and I started looking for people that might help. Psychiatrists, psychologists, proctologists. I didn't care if it was medical and started with a P, I was good, okay? And so I start calling these people. And I get them on the telephone, and here's what I would get. I'm sorry, you have reached the office of Dr. Such and Such. Our office hours are from 8:30 a.m. to 5:30 p.m. You have reached us after office hours. If you would leave your name and number, we will be happy to give you a call in the morning, and have a nice day. To hear that when you're thinking of ending your life really ticks you off. And I got that on the first call, the second call, the third call, the fourth call, the fifth call, the sixth call. On the seventh call, somebody actually answered the telephone. Some guy answered the phone. Hello, Dr. Such and Such's office. Hi, this is Chuck Gallagher. I need to talk to somebody. To which the response was, our office hours are from 8:30 a.m. to 5:30 p.m. I'm actually getting ready to leave. I'm running late to meet my wife for dinner, but if you'll leave me your name and number, I'll give you a call in the morning. And I said, I'm considering suicide. And then he said, let's talk. I don't remember how long we talked. It could have been 2 minutes. It could have been 20 minutes. It could have been 2 hours. I don't have a clue. But there is one thing that is like etched in my mind. It's like having a tombstone that's etched. I mean, this is just seared. He said to me these words, and I can hear it to this day. He said, you have made a terrible mistake. But you are not a mistake. Think about those words. You have made a terrible mistake, but you are not a mistake. He proceeded to say, the choices that you make tonight, tomorrow, and in the future will define your life forever and the legacy you leave to your 2 children. Make those choices wisely. Every choice has a consequence. The next day I flew home. I had many hours on an airplane. What is it that I can do and what's going to take place? I considered, I have got to go tell my wife. Yeah, that was not going to be an exciting encounter. Ooh, I've got to go tell my partners. That's going to not be an exciting encounter. Wife partners. Let me try the partners that gives me an audience first. So I went in. Imagine walking into this building. Imagine for a moment if you were in my shoes, a trusted investment advisor, all the credentials, having stepped across that ethical line into unethical territory, even so much as fraud, and now coming back and telling those people you're associated with, oh, by the way, let me share with you, I'm a liar and a thief. That was what I had to do. I remember walking in. I sat down and I told them what I had done. I remember one of them sitting there. I'm going to pick on you for just a second. But I remember one of them sitting there. He looked at me, steel blue eyes. And he said to me, he said, I have a solution. I was sitting there thinking, yes. I felt like that movie Dumb and Dumber, when the guy says to the girl, is there a chance? And she says, 1 in a million. And he's, yes, there is a chance. That's what I felt like. It was like, oh, yes. I had dreamed on that airplane about the possibility that these guys would beat me up, rake me over the coals, tell me what a lowlife I was, go and borrow money legitimately, pay off the people, keep it quiet, hush, hush, let's not let anybody know there's a solution. So when he said, I have a solution, I was on it. Then he said, the next words were, I think you should commit suicide. Really? He said, the 2-year contestability clause on your insurance is passed. He said, we didn't deserve this. This could ruin our firm. He said, your wife and children don't deserve this. He said, the people you stole from don't deserve this. The insurance money would pay them off, and people in the community would take pity on your wife and children. You don't deserve to be alive. That wasn't exactly what I had in mind, by the way. Another partner looked at me and he said, with all the Donald Trump there, he said, you're fired. I kind of expected that one, okay? That was just, it was kind of, I was there. I understood that. And then he said to me, he says, but he said, when it's all said and done, he said, probably you'll survive. You likely will have a career in sales and marketing. This past summer, I resigned a public company as a vice president of sales and marketing. One person read my mind from the night before. The other person predicted the future. Going home to my wife was a bit different. Because as you can imagine in the room, think about it. Whether it is your personal life, whether it is the relationship you have with your spouse, fiance, significant other, whether it is the relationship you have with your employer, everything is based upon one fundamental concept. It's called trust. That's the relationship that you have with your clients. It is based on trust. And when trust is broken, it becomes very difficult to heal, if it can be healed at all. And in my wife's case, the reality was I had created a vast illusion of what it meant to be married to Chuck Gallagher. And yes, there was legitimate success, interspersed with a lot of illegitimate activities to create the aura of extraordinary success. And then one day she hears, dear, I'm a liar and a thief. It was a life-changing day for her as well. Now, let me do this, because as I look at the expressions on your face, some of the folks in the room are going to ask this question, okay, well, were you just like naturally a bad egg, a bad person? Is it just you kind of have a propensity to want to do bad things, or what happened? So I'm going to rewind the tape just a little bit further. My dad died when I was 2 years old. He died of diabetic complications, nothing that anybody could control. And my mother, she did not have a high school education. We lived in the southeast United States. Some of you can tell that I have a bit of a southern accent. Anyway, the reality is a single parent, female, in the late 60s, early 70s, raising a child, rearing a child, without a high school education, there's not a lot that a person can do. Now, back in those days, there were several jobs. One job was you could work in a textile mill, manufacturing whatever textiles used to be manufactured in the Southeast. Of course, they have now been shipped to China. Or you could work as a janitor, because most anybody can sling them up. Or you could work in the lunchroom, because opening a can of peas or carrots or whatever it happens to be, most anybody could do. And she did all three of those. But I'll never forget my mother. God bless her, love her dearly. But as a little kid, she would look at me and she would say, do not be concerned about your economic circumstances. She said, that's not relevant. She said, look past that, get a good education, because you can be somebody. You can be somebody. And you know what? I got that. I understood that. That made sense to me. So as a high school kid, we lived in the projects. Now most folks, whenever you say, "You lived in the projects?" Really? You know, like it's terrible and you'll never get out. And a lot of people had that attitude. It was like there was this wall here and you couldn't get past the wall. I was always going to be stuck in the economic circumstance I was in. That was their attitude. It wasn't mine. I took a broom handle, cut the end of it off, hammered a nail in it, and went around picking up trash. They'd throw out trash, I'd pick it up. I made money for picking up trash. It just made sense to me. Do something that would get you out. So after graduating high school, I decided, of course, I was going to go to college. That was part of bettering the education. And I put myself through school. I got my degree in accounting. I got a master's degree in accounting. I became a CPA. But back in the, we'll call it early 80s, by the way, there was a recession then, as we are experiencing now. Maybe not as dramatic, but they come and they go like the tide. But back in those days, one of the issues that took place was this concept of, well, I'm going to call it the look. And what I mean by the look was if you were a financial services representative, you needed to be successful. I mean, you needed to look success. You needed to ooze success. If you had the look, if you had the right watch, the right coat, the right shoes, the right car, the right home, if you lived in the right neighborhood, you were oozing this success. And successful people wanted to work with successful people. The problem was there was also a bit of an education called leverage. And I'll never forget one of the lessons learned was you should use leverage as your friend. The concept out of college was buy the most expensive house that you can barely afford. I mean, that payment needed to hurt. But here's what would happen, generally. This year hasn't demonstrated that, but for the most part, what would happen is the house would slowly appreciate in value, which meant you were gaining equity, and your income, because you were starting your career, would probably escalate as well, which meant the pain of making those payments was not as significant. And the longer you made the payments, the more the mortgage went down, which meant you created more equity in the house, which meant you could borrow more money on a second loan against the house, and the more you borrowed, the more stuff you could have, because the more stuff you had, the more important you were, the more successful it created, or the illusion was. In 1985, I'll never forget, I was behind on my house payment. There are a lot of people today that we read about that are behind on their house payments. I was behind on my house payment. My wife and I had just had our first child. In the firm that I worked in, I had a reasonable salary, and at the end of tax season, after all of the tax work was done, we got very large bonuses. So the bonus would kind of carry all of the nice things to the next part of the year. But I was behind. So I get a call from a banker. Phone rings one day, pick up the telephone, banker's on the other end. "Chuck, this is banker, blah, 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 blah." He reads off his name and he says, "You know, I need to talk to you." He said, "I hate to raise this question, but according to our records, you're 2 months behind in your house payment. Is there a problem?" Well, here's a reality check. I was 2 months behind in my house payment. But I didn't want to admit that to the banker. I mean, that would be just kind of dumb. Think about it. Here I am. I'm tax partner in a CPA firm. I help people manage their money. If I say to him, "Well, you know, you're absolutely right. I'm 2 months behind in my house payment," it's not going to lend a lot of credibility to me being involved in helping people manage their money if I can't manage my own. So I did the only thing that I knew how to do, that was dance. And I said to him, "Are you sure that the payment hasn't been misapplied?" Those of us in the financial business, we know all of the nice buzzwords, so you probably have enough in your repertoire that you could throw somebody off at least for a short period of time. He said, "I don't think so, but let me check." Phone goes down. Now, I sit back at this time and I'm thinking to myself, "Oh man, I've got a problem." I am 2 months behind in my house payment. I'm going to get a big old bonus in about 3 months, but I don't have the money now. What am I going to do? Now, I was trustee of a trust. In those days, as a CPA, I was responsible for a client's funds to fund the college education for his kids, except the oldest kid was 10 years old, which meant they wouldn't need it for 8 years. So I had this conversation. Here I am. I'm Chuck. I looked at myself and I said, you know, Chuck, you've got a problem. You need some money. My trustee self looked back and said, well, we could probably solve that problem, but you understand you're going to have to pay interest, and we're going to have to make this legitimate. So I said, well, you know, I got that. I understand. No problem. I mean, you know, we just need to work out a little something here, you know, a little something, something. And then I looked back at myself and said, okay, well, now I'm going to go ahead and draft the note. And I sat down at Word. I typed this note up. It was on a nice white piece of paper that said, I, Chuck Gallagher, being of sound mind and body, agree to pay back the trust X amount of dollars plus interest, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and I printed it out. Now let's stop for just a minute, because there's something significant that just took place, and I want you to get it. It's true across the board for most anything that is unethical. There are 3 components, and I need you to see what those 3 components are. Number 1, the first component is need. I needed money. There was need. Today you can see that exemplified in many, many cases. People get calls from their credit card companies. The credit card company has reduced the credit line that's available. You were expecting to use that to pay the college education. You're behind on the house payment. The house has gone down in value, and you're sitting there thinking, man, not only do we have no equity, we got negative equity. We are upside down. What's going to take place here? We're behind in the house payment. The wife gets laid off. The husband gets laid off. Now all of a sudden the income stream isn't there. There is need all around. Needs number 1. Number 2 is opportunity. I had the opportunity. I was trustee of a trust. I had access to the funds. Let me paint the picture much broader on opportunity. It's very important in the financial services industry. By virtue of the company you work for, I don't care which company it is, but by virtue of the company you work for and by virtue of the job that you perform, you are deemed to be experts. And as experts, you can easily go to someone, I'm not trying to put ideas in your head, I'm just calling a spade a spade. The reality is you can easily go to someone and say, you know, I work for X company in the financial services arena, but I have been contacted by one of our key investors for a private equity opportunity. We only are offering this to select folks. It is outside of the scope of what I normally deal with. Would you like in? You might ask yourself the question, how in the world did a Bernie Madoff scam so many people? Now there's a multitude of reasons, but one of the main ones was Bernie made it exclusive. He played to people's emotion. It was like being part of a big country club. I mean, you couldn't get Bernie. But if you could get in to be part of the club, you were somebody. Need, opportunity, third is rationalization. Now, everybody sitting in this room, myself included, I'm going to be just as candid and honest with you as I can be. Everybody sitting in this room could tell me today the difference between an ethical choice and an unethical choice. You could tell me the difference between integrity and lack of integrity. You could tell me the difference between honesty and lack of honesty or dishonesty. There is no question that you know it. But when faced with temptation, the question becomes, what will you do about it? Will you cross that boundary and say, okay, I have a need, I need some money. 2, I have the opportunity, there it is. Can I cross the boundary and rationalize that something unethical, dishonest, and lacks integrity is actually okay? Because if you can rationalize it, you can do it. And my rationalization was, I am just borrowing money. I had the note to prove it. Piece of paper. It was right there. I typed it myself. Printed it out on paper. The banker calls me back in a couple of hours. He says, Chuck, he said, I'm sorry, but he says, it does appear we're behind. Oh, then I was good. So I said, you're absolutely right, and I feel terrible. My wife pays the bills. Okay, ladies, that was a lie. I'm sorry. I know I just reduced myself in the rankings with you, but let me just call it what it was. Because, if you're going to do something wrong, you may as well just really carry it on out, because you would have no way of knowing. My wife pays the bills, and after having our first child, she just completely got so carried away with it with Christmas and all that kind of stuff that she failed to make the payment, and I am so embarrassed. I'm going to bring you a check up there right now. I can't believe this has happened. I said, you have no idea how I feel. Then we had a moment. He says, it's all right. He said, I'll admit to you, I passed a bad check once when I was in college. We had one of those bud moments, it was a male bonding experience. I screwed up on the payment. He passed a bad check. We were now tight. Sent me more business than you could shake a stick with. Oh, by the way, I did pay that back. But I found out it was easy. Didn't seem to be a consequence to that choice. So I went back. I bought bigger cars, nicer clothes, bigger house, all of the trappings of success. And I'll be candid with you. Business increased because people bought into the illusion. But every choice has a consequence. And when the card was pulled in 1990, the house of cards collapsed. So what happened after I told my partners and wife? Well, I had no job. We had to sell all of our possessions. Fortunately, I had a place to move into with my mother-in-law. Life changed dramatically. I have to be candid and say I did not see value in myself. But there were friends and family that looked at me, and somehow they were able to pull back all of the illusions and all of this web of deceit that I had created, and they saw some value in me. So on January 1st, 1991, I was given a job. I worked at a company. I became their controller. I made $25,000 a year doing that job. That was a $200,000 decrease from my income prior to that. And you know what? I was thrilled to have a job. I was thrilled that someone saw some value in me that I didn't see in myself. And with the help of friends and family, I was fortunately able to make restitution. In fact, the local district attorney didn't wish to prosecute me. I used to do his tax return. He thought I did a pretty good job for him. Now, by this point in time, I had lost my license, lost my home, marriage was on the rocks, I had a $200,000 decrease in income, I was barely able to support my 2 children, and I had made complete restitution to the folks that were victimized by my Ponzi scheme. So as a result of that, he said, you know what, enough is enough, this is okay. It was the summer of 1991. I can almost hear it as a song. I'm sitting there at the house one day and there's this knock on the door. So I'm thinking, I wonder who's going to be at the door today. I mean, this is just, why would someone be at my door? I figure they're either handing out religious tracts or they are selling something, and the curiosity killed the cat. I looked through the little peephole, to see who was there, and there were these 2 guys standing outside in suits. So I'm thinking to myself, okay, well, let's just see what the deal with that is. So I opened the door. And these 2 guys are standing there, coats buttoned, very professional, little stuffy, and they said, "Are you Charles Gallagher?" Now, I don't know what it's like here, but in the Southeast United States, if somebody calls you by your given name, generally that means you're in trouble. So these guys calling me by my Given name, I knew there was a little problem there. Then they reached in their pockets and opened up these beautiful gold badges. One guy was a criminal investigator from the Department of Labor. The other a criminal investigator from the IRS. The criminal investigator from the Department of Labor, he wanted to convict me of embezzlement because of a violation of ERISA, the Employee Retirement Income Security Act of 1974, which, by the way, I was a specialist in teaching continuing professional education courses. Like you don't think I knew what I was doing. The IRS, that's a different group. They wanted to get me for tax evasion, not paying tax on stolen money. That never crossed my mind, okay? It didn't. I mean, I can't imagine, like 1040, line 37, other income, stolen money. Who would think about doing that? If I'm stealing and I don't want anybody to know and I've rationalized in my head I'm just borrowing money, then I'm not going to think about paying tax on it. Oh no, both branches of the government, let's prosecute Chuck. Took a while for that to take place. In 1995, I in fact pled guilty, as I agreed to do. In the summer of 1995, I stood before a judge. Now I had lived for 4 years. I had made complete restitution. I was thinking, I am living a clean life. Surely with no criminal background, it would be probation. The judge bangs the gavel. 18 months active, 3 years probation. We will tell you when to report. Okay. Life changed again. And on October 2nd, 1995, I took those 23 steps, opened the door, and became 11-642-058. I walk in. I turn myself in. They say, okay, we're going to introduce you to a holding cell here. Read this material, and they hand me these papers. We'll be back with you in a little while. I walk into this room, I sit down. It is an 8x8 cinder block room with a stainless steel toilet and a wooden bench. And I sit down and I start looking at this photocopied material. Now this is the federal government. You think if they got a print shop to print money, they could at least print it and it would be nice and organized and neat and look nice. Oh no, this stuff had been photocopied. It was crooked. Some of the words were off the page. It was like, really? And these were the rules. That took 10 minutes. For the next 2 hours and 50 minutes, I sat there thinking to myself, what have I done? Well, I was introduced to my cell. I had a roommate. His name was Buck. I was Chuck. Buck and Chuck. I don't know if they did that for comic relief in the unit or whatever it happened to be, but I walk in. He was a small little African-American guy. He was in there for drugs. He looks at me, just up and down, just looked at me. Didn't say a word. I thought to myself, I don't know what the rules are. So I figured, well, I won't say anything to him. He says something, I'll say something. Next day, 24 hours, he comes in. He looks at me. And I'm not making fun of the way he talked, but this is really what it sounded like. He says, yo, man. He said, what you in here for anyway? I'm thinking to myself, I've got to be tough. I need to be mean. I can't get mean. Mean just doesn't work for me. But I tried my mean, and I said, well, I'm a thief. He said, word? I said, word? Yo, man, word. Word. Yo, man, you don't know what I'm talking about, do you? And then he just flies out of the cell, and I'm like, what just happened? I don't understand. I hadn't got it figured out. Now, some of you all get this, okay? But there, you have no idea. I speak to audiences all over the country, and it's really funny because the older the hair, the older we are, there'll be people who are like, I don't understand what just took place, okay? So, you got to have the translation, word. So, in my vernacular, really, you're not kidding. Are you telling me the truth? That's amazing. Are you giving me your word? Okay? But as soon as I was going through that little gyration in my head, Buck comes back in the room. He says, yo, man, he says, I tell you what. He says, I make you a deal. I'm thinking, I've been here 24 hours. And now somebody wanting to make a deal with me, and he's a convict. Then it hit me. I'm a convict. I guess it's okay. I said, what you got in mind? He says, look, he says, you won't survive in here. He says, you don't understand the lingo. You don't understand the language. You don't understand what's going to take place. He said, I'll teach you how to survive. He said, I'll teach you the lingo. He said, I'll have your back. If you'll teach me how to speak correctly so that when I get out of here, I have a chance at getting a real job. Buck had more integrity than most of the people that I did business with before I ever went in. He understood the principles. He understood that it was based on honesty, that it was truth. Even though there are times we don't want to hear the truth, it's based on trust and truth. In the financial services business, reality check. Sometimes you have to tell your clients things they don't want to hear. You may not have the solution for everything that they want. There may be people that you need to involve to help bring them that solution. You may not be the end-all to end-all. But they expect your integrity, your honesty, your competence. They expect you to act in an ethical manner. They expect you to act like I didn't. I remember Christmas in prison. Most everybody would assume that spending time in federal prison, you can tolerate it, and especially if you're in a prison of 500 men or so, that you're tough. You just deal with it. It's just time. But on Christmas Day, I would say most of the inmates spent some time shedding a tear. It wasn't necessarily in front of everybody, but we shed tears. I remember laying on the top bunk, tears streaming down my face, and I had this weird vision. And I say vision because it really was a blast from the past. But I remember back in the 80s going to the grocery store. Now this is weird, okay? But I went to the grocery store, and that particular day I was going in to get like steak and shrimp or whatever it happened to be. And so I go to the back to the meat counter, I get the stuff that I'm going to get to put on the grill, and I'm walking out and I get in the express lane. So long story short, here I am, I'm coming along, and I get up to the checkout lady. She's there at the counter. And I put my things down, and she looks at me and she says, you're Chuck Gallagher. And I'm sitting there thinking to myself, who is this? I didn't recognize the lady. She says, we went to high school together. She had on a little name badge. It said Susie. And so being a reasonably nice person, I said, well, hi, Susie, how are you? Gosh, it's been a long time since I've seen you. Thinking, I've never seen this person before in my life. I'm sure we went to high school, but doggone if I knew where it was. And she said, you know, I've read so much about you in the paper. She said, you seem so successful. She said, I'm so proud of everything that I see. And I'm sitting there and said, well, thank you, thank you very much. Thank you, I appreciate that, but I just wanted to check out. And then she asked me this question. She said, do you have any children? Well, we just had our first. And I said back to her, I said, well, yes, in fact, I do. We have our first child. His name's Rob. And then I made this fateful mistake. I looked back at her and I said, what about you? Have any children? Yes, 3. And then she reaches down under the counter, grabs her purse, sets it up on the counter, opens it up, takes the wallet out and goes, and all of these pictures start flowing. And she's telling me about all of the children. And I'm sitting there thinking to myself, that was a stupid question to ask. I just really want to check out. But she's telling me about all the children and what they mean to her. And so when she finally finishes, I said, Susie, it has been so good to see you, but we're holding up the line. I've got to go. She says, it's okay, Chuck. She said, don't worry about it. She said, we'll see each other again. She said, it gets so good to see you. And as I walked out of the store, ladies, let me tell you something. I know I'm going to offend you. I'm not intending to do that. Here I am. I'm going out to my new BMW. Going home. We're going to put steak and shrimp on the grill. And this girl was a checkout chick at the grocery store. Christmas, 1995. She was more of somebody than I ever dreamed of being. See, on that day, she was home with her 3 children. And on that day, she could hug her children. She could go to the convenience store and get a gallon of milk. She could make waffles that morning. Whatever it happened to be, she was able to experience her time with her children. On that day, the best I could do was stand in line behind other inmates, waiting for my 3-minute telephone call, collect, to pick up the phone, call my 2 sons, and say, Rob, Alex, this is Dad. Merry Christmas. Every choice has a consequence. Before I took those 23 steps, I thought I made good choices. After I became 11-6-42-058, I found out vividly that every choice has a consequence. You may not know when the consequence will take place. You may not know what the consequence is. You may not know how it will manifest in your life, but we cannot avoid the consequences. Before I took those 23 steps, I lived life as an illusion. I created an example, an aura, a concept of what success was. After I became 11-6-42-058, I found out that every illusion goes away. You can be a master illusionist, but eventually, in our lives, we come back to reality. No matter what we say, no matter how important we make ourselves, no matter how grand the illusion, eventually the truth comes out. And before I took those 23 steps, I thought I was successful. I mean, I had all of the trappings of what success really meant. After I became 11-6-42-058, I found out something. It was profound. Success has nothing to do with the external. It isn't the watch, the shoes, the clothes, the home, the car. It isn't the title. It isn't the look on the business card or the company you work for. Success has everything to do with the impact that you have on other people's lives. That's true success. If I ask the question, can you remember who won the Masters in 1995, 96, 97, 98? Do you remember who the best swimmer was in the last 3 Olympics? You know, there's fame that lasts for a moment. On the other hand, if I ask you the question, who was the most impactful teacher in your life? Likely you'll remember that person because they understood the concept of success. So, ladies and gentlemen, my mother said to me, she says, son, you can be somebody. That's true. The reality is every choice has a consequence. The choices you make will define your life forever. Interestingly enough, you get to choose. Thank you.